And this kind of raises a kind of a dovetailing question. Interaction before the broadcast on Twitter, a fellow made the assertion that the idea of hell is strictly a New Testament idea, that it wasn't put forth at all in the Old Testament. That was his first claim.
Great.
And then the second claim that he made was that any reference we find in the Old Testament to hell is borrowing and lifting directly from Zoroastrianism. In other words, Isaiah chapter 66, which specifically speaks about the final destination of the ungodly, this person says is clear cutting and pasting from the Persian religion of Zoroastrianism. How would we respond to that?
Well, again, if you heard this on Twitter, I think that's a first strike for reliability, but let's...
No, this is an interaction on Twitter. This is what this person's asserting on Twitter.
Yes, and that's, again, a mark against them. But if, on the other hand, someone's allowed to say things and make references to multi-syllable words like Zoroastrianism, that's all well and good, but can you back up your claim? Can you show me where that interaction, chapter and verse, took place? Can you maybe, for instance, and this is, again, not to take too much of an intellectual aside, I did a interactive video on Zoroastrianism. I read through their primary sources and a little bit into the history surrounding it.
So if someone wants to find out what Zoroastrianism actually teaches,
you just look up Zoroastrianism. They'll have their text listed out for you.
No,
and you
but
can
where can they get a hold of the video that you made on that?
Oh, on YouTube, it would be Shady Oak Ministries, and I give my citations in the description.
Okay.
But the point being made is this: in a nutshell, Zoroastrianism, there's a Persian bent usually to it, but there's been other versions, some Greek, some, not Iranian, because that is Persian, but also extended Middle Eastern perspectives, even some going as far as Egypt, where the stories have been skewed a little bit, so we don't actually know what it is. And the reason for that, especially in India, is because Zoroastrianism was the primary belief of a certain individual by the name of Cyrus the Great, or Darius the Mede, and his culture, where essentially they narrowed down their concerns, not their awareness, but their concerns, to two main gods. Ahriman, who is the evil god, the chief demon, and Ormazd. And don't ask me to spell it, because I can never figure out where the Z and the D is in the matter of it. Persian's fun.
Yeah.
But he's the good god. He's a specifically ethnocentric Persian deity that wants his people and his ethnicity to ultimately be the inheritors of this world. And they usually have three different versions of the story. Either, and this is the one thing they all have in common, when Ahriman, the chief demon, created everything, Ormazd wanted to make it serve a purpose, but Ahriman had the right to decide what to do with his stuff, so there's a conflict between them. When he created the universe from materials I won't explain what, the conflict is essentially a 4,000-year cycle between them, where Ormazd has the upper hand, their level, Ahriman has the upper hand, and then the cycle continues. Others say that it was a definitive moment in history where Ahriman created the world, and Ormazd is slowly taking it over to rule over it forever. And by the way, note that, because that actually didn't come into being until the 6th century BC, and you know who were interacting with the Persians around that time. But I digress. The other interesting aspect to this story is, again, the belief of many gods, and they're just focusing on these two. But it's a dualistic theology, and if you want to know Zoroastrianism in function, just look at Star Wars. The goodness of the world is there's the dark and there's the light. Some choose the dark, like Ahriman. Some choose the light, like Ormazd. You want to be on the light because they're generally seen as the good guys, but in terms of theology and truth, you can't really say that Ormazd has more of a right to be worshipped than Ahriman, because they're both gods. In fact, Ahriman has more of a right because he created everything. Ormazd didn't. That aside.
So the bad god created everything.
Yeah, and I won't tell you how, but it's kind of yucky. The point being made is this. In the account, the Persians are hoping for this messianic kingdom. This is the most popular form of how it's practiced today. And interestingly enough, I alluded to this earlier, that view only came into writing when the Jews, who were living in Babylon at the time, were then taken under the custody of Cyrus the Great when he conquered Babylon in the 6th century BC. And this was, of course, recorded for us in the book of Daniel, chapter 6, or the end of chapter 5 as well. But what's interesting about that, and noting the point, people say, oh, Judaism borrowed from Zoroastrianism in this messianic view. Well, why do you say that? Well, because we have temples to Zoroastrianism that predate Judaism, which is misleading. The people either are assuming too much about Zoroastrianism being a linear record, which we can prove within 2 minutes, or the existence of temples that have the zodiac, which are also included, granted, in Zoroastrian worship, are in existence then. That's the only way they link the two. The argument is because Zoroastrianism makes this claim and Judaism makes this claim, because Zoroastrianism as a concept is older. We don't know what they taught before this, and this is where the third point is going to be key. We don't know what they taught before this, but we do know when they interacted with the Jews, suddenly it started to sound a little bit more Jewishy, and this is incredibly common. When you look at Greek paganism or Roman paganism, the cult of Mithras was a copy and paste borrowing of the accounts of Jesus, and we know why and when, because it postdates Christianity. We know when the Greeks were interacting with Christians.
So it kind of gets into the which came first, the chicken or the egg, kind of an argument.
And we can know for certain because guess what happened to the Zoroastrian faith, God bless you, during around the 8th century or so AD. Islam took over Persia. And all of the faithful Zoroastrians, the people who were loyal to their culture and ethnic religion, were driven out of the land, subjugated, or forced into conversion to Islam. So they either had to abandon their faith, they had to flee their country and take their beliefs with them,
right,
or they had to basically allow their religion and its practices to run into disrepair and a second-class citizen status, while Muslims would then dominate both ecologically, economically, and geographically.
Right.
So all this time, and for 400 years, by the way, Zoroastrianism was the not dominant faith in Persia, where it was largely centered. Most of them were either fleeing to India, where you see vestiges of it still to this day, or were dispersed throughout Muslim lands and ultimately into non-existence. When they came back, that's when we start getting writing about Zoroastrianism, reflecting on the old ways before their exile. We don't even have their sacred texts before they were driven out by the Muslims 700 or 800 years rather, after the time of Christ, and another 600 years after that when Daniel was interacting with Cyrus the Mede. Now we have Cyrus the Mede's writings and we know that he had some regard for this ethnic culture, but it's all guesswork because guess who was writing the accounts of Daniel and these references to Cyrus the Mede? Either people thousands of years removed from the fact, just like with the Zoroastrian text, who could have easily have borrowed from Jewish, Christian, Muslim, or Hindu themes on the way. Or they're just making this stuff up. But the point being made is that when we ask, what are the actual dates? You can say Zoroastrianism existed before Judaism. I raise my hand with you and say that is incredibly likely. You can even say that the worship of Ormazd and Ahriman as a concept existed before or at least around the time of Judaism. We do have variations of the story that would fit that cyclical battle. That's the opinion that I take, and some scholars do as well. But the claim and the assertion that Judaism borrowed from Zoroastrianism or Christianity borrowed from Zoroastrianism, we don't even have to go to the Old Testament. It's verifiably false because we know when Jewish writings about the religion existed, and it is thousands of years before the time that we have anything concerning writing that we can test and verify. So it would be as if I have my Bible here. If we were to compare this to the Zoroastrian claim that the idea of hell and so forth was just taken from those things, yes, it is true that there are graphic depictions of a state of torment in Ahriman's realm. But the point is still moot if you can't show me chapter and verse. If I were to put myself in the same camp as Zoroastrians, this would be the account of the Old Testament. Moses, around 1450 BC, apparently gave us the Torah, the law of Moses, the first 5 books of the Bible, and the history that followed. But we have no evidence of it in existence anywhere, no mention of it. All their culture was taken over by outside conquest and subjugation. Now, we don't have the Dead Sea Scrolls, we don't have the Masoretic text, we don't have anything in regards to the Old Testament, nor the New, until around the medieval period, when after this time of exile by the Romans and the Assyrians and the Babylonians and so forth were eventually cultivated into Europe, they were able to write their Bibles for the first time. Now, if that were the case,
would not be a real reliable text.
I would not buy it in any language, culture, or geography, and that's the point. If they depend on your ignorance of something, or if they just know enough about something to mention this obscure faith that not enough people know enough about to get the upper hand in a conversation, that's either manipulative or misleading. But either way, it's not pointing you to the truth. If you know enough about Zoroastrianism, which, let's be honest, very few people do, I don't even know that much, and I've at least taken the time to read some of it, the point is still moot because we don't actually know what Zoroastrianism really was in the beginning.
Okay, but even granting the assumption that Zoroastrianism was a well-developed and robust religious system of that time,
that never adopted any other views but its own unilaterally. Big assumptions.
Okay. Why would a thoroughgoing Jewish individual like Isaiah cut and paste from a religious worldview that directly contradicts the main thesis of his book, a huge portion of which, Isaiah chapters 40 through 50 almost, devoted to the idea that there's one and only one God, and that the gods of the nations are idols, they're literally nothings? Why in the world would a prophet like Isaiah then cut and paste from a text that was devoted to the worship of at least 2 gods and maybe more?
Well, I'd have to assume that he either was trying to start his own cult, that he was deliberately misleading his audience, or that Isaiah himself didn't know anything about his own belief system and got some things mistaken. But notice, I have to make all these assumptions, not from the text, not from his culture, not from his background, not from his character, not from the information he presents, and not even in the information written concerning him and his mentions of a judgment in the hereafter, as well as Daniel, as well as Genesis, as well as the Psalms, and so forth.
So people who say that the Old Testament prophets liberally cut and pasted and borrowed from other religious texts and other religious concepts and sort of tossed them all in a whirring blender and gave us what we know as the message of the Bible today, it simply doesn't stack up to the facts on the ground.
No, you need to establish, if there's an exchange of ideas, first of all, the means. You have the ability to access this information, and we know that the Jews had no interactions with the Persians, which Zoroastrianism owes its roots and foundations into this day, until the time of Daniel, and well into the time of Daniel. So note that first as a challenge, since we have plenty of doctrine in Judaism mentioning hell and final judgment before Daniel's time and after,
right,
that are very different from Zoroastrianism, which you can check on your own.
So the biggie would be, how do we explain Isaiah, who wrote well before the time of interaction between the Jews and the Persians, liberally borrowing from a Persian religion when there was no cultural interaction between them, or very limited cultural interaction between them, at least as far as the Medes and the Persians were concerned. Babylonians had their own pantheon of gods that they worshipped, that the Jews interacted with, obviously.
And they didn't have interactions with Babylon until Hezekiah.
Yeah. So in order to make that system work,
means, motive, opportunity. Do you have the interaction? Not until Judaism's well established. Do you have a motive? Not if you know even a smidgen of Jewish culture. Do they have the opportunity? Not until Judaism has already been established.
And the smidgen of Jewish culture was after they were sent into Babylonian exile, the idea of syncretism, the idea of the coexist bumper sticker mentality, that all religious perspectives are leading to that one great ocean, which is God. That would have been something that would probably get you stoned if you tried to promote that. in Israel at that time.
You can reference that not only before in the writings of the Old Testament prophets, like you mentioned with Isaiah, but you can also check afterwards, because if there was ever a time where you could go along to get along in Jewish culture, it would have been not just the Persian period. They were pretty tolerant as far as other religions were concerned. If you discount the incident with Haman, that was different. But don't you think Judas Maccabeus might have had an opportunity to maybe fudge the details about Jupiter?
And what we're talking about here was the period of time. It's predicted in the book of Daniel, but is described in, say, the apocryphal book of Maccabees, where Israel was taken over by the Greeks. And one Greek in particular, ruler, fellow by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes, wanted to wipe out Judaism and institute Greek paganism as the only religion that would be practiced in his territory. Among other things that this Antiochus Epiphanes did was, if he found out that a family had circumcised a child, he would have the mother and the child literally nailed to a wall as an example to other people not to do such a thing. He took a statue of Zeus and he offered it in a sacrifice to it in the temple, a foreshadowing of the ultimate abomination that causes desolation that the Antichrist is going to do someday. But the idea behind all of that was that he did find some Jews that were willing to go along to get along, but the vast majority of the Jews said no way. They formed a guerrilla war campaign against him, and in an amazing set of circumstances, ended up driving out the Greeks, not because they didn't like Greek culture, not because they didn't like Greek economics, but because they found Greek religion and compromising with this religion completely and totally abhorrent to their sensibilities, correct?
Correct. So before the time of Zoroastrianism's not only existence, but any interaction with Judaism, we have writings that would directly conflict with the idea that Jews would be syncretistic about it, at least the faithful Jews. After the time of Zoroastrianism and their time in Persia, where exchanges could have taken place, it was the last time that Jews would have ever considered adopting views other than their own into their religion. And we see this continuing all the way to and beyond the time of Jesus. Even to this day, you see them stubbornly holding to and keeping themselves apart from any Gentile beliefs, apart from the traditions handed down to them by their rabbis. Hasn't kept them from error, but it has kept them from the assumptions this individual had to make.
So you could say a lot of things about Jewish thought, particularly during the time of the writing of the Bible, but one of them wouldn't it be that the authors folded, pasted, and mutilated concepts from other religions and created their own.
Not if you know anything about the history surrounding Jewish culture and religion, not if you know anything about the beliefs of Zoroastrianism, basically not if you know things. If that, of course, is still a requirement on the internet, we'll see. Yeah. But I'm being, of course, facetious.
Yeah, okay. Well, interesting interaction that we had beforehand. So the objections were that the Zoroastrians didn't worship idols, did they?
Yes, they did. They specifically focus on Ormazd, or Ahura Mazda, as they'll one day call him, in order to glorify themselves as a Persian nationality. But if we're going to say, well, they didn't set up altars and idols, what do you think they had in those temples? They are very much prolific. And if you ever go to Persian festivals and so forth, the eagles and sprouts and stuff, these are all pagan images meant to represent various aspects of Ormazd. Now, I don't know of many Persians who worship Ahriman, but they acknowledge him as someone who could be credited with creation, which is something that you attribute only to a god.
Yeah.
But on it goes. There are demons, of course, that buffeted Zoroaster during his times in which he was tested as a prophet of Ormazd. And, of course, the trials that he went through are, interestingly enough, very reminiscent of Jesus' time, but once again, all those sources post-date Christianity by 1,100 years. So do the math. But the point being made is this: the struggles in the spiritual realm, they identify many gods in most of the accounts, and they also worship specifically Ormazd through images, through temples, through rituals, and sometimes in not very nice ways.
So I guess the moral of our story is there's people that throw things out on the internet and have no idea what they're talking about.
Let it not be said among us.
Yes.
So with that being said, feel free to check up on the homework that was done on that, and don't take my word for it, because as we saw on Twitter, that's just as dangerous. But going out...
So go to Shady Oak
Ministries.
Ministries.org.
Yes, our Shady Oak Ministries is the YouTube channel's name.
Okay, go to YouTube, Shady Oaks Ministries, if you want to get up to speed on all of that. You've got a whole Bible study that you put together on this.
Yeah, why I don't believe Zoroastrianism. It's a part of a series.
Yeah, so there you go.